Hi, and welcome to Voices of Esalen. I'm your host, Sam Stern, and I'll be guiding you through this program. Today, I have on two guests who are better at doing podcasts than me. They are the brilliant writers, Steve Almond and Cheryl Strayed. You might know Cheryl Strayed by her book, Wild. It's a memoir of her trip hiking the Pacific Crest Trail as a novice. It's widely read. It was turned into a movie starring Reese Witherspoon recently. She's also the author of the book Torch, as well as Tiny Beautiful Things, a book that Cheryl says became a self-help book almost by accident. Tiny Beautiful Things is a collection of letters and replies drawn from her popular advice column, Dear Sugar. Steve Almond is the author of many books himself, including God Bless America, My Life in Heavy Metal, and CandyFreak. Steve is hilarious and a highly observant student of human nature, which may in part be due to him having been raised by a pair of psychoanalysts. I was raised by one, so I have an opinion in this matter. This pair also, however, host an advice-oriented podcast called Dear Sugar, where they offer touching, engaging responses to listeners' letters. It's a very cool podcast, kind of an existentialist advice column for the modern era, if you ask me. Steve and Cheryl are incredibly articulate, thoughtful people, very deep, and they artfully fielded my vague questions about writing and what it means to be a person who thinks about other people for a living. And I love it when my guests make this program run so smoothly and seamlessly. I could have just put a mic down in front of Steve and Cheryl and walked out of the room, and I'm sure the result would have been equally as brilliant. These people are creative allies. They're creative role models for us all. I think it's fair to say they're good sports. I made them sit on the floor for our interview because I didn't have any chairs, but they adapted. They survived. So with no further ado, here's my conversation with Cheryl Strayed and Steve Almond. This is great. I haven't interviewed two people at the same time, so I'm a little new at that. And I don't know, just thanks so much for taking the time to do this.
Thank you. We're glad to be here.
Totally great.
How's the week been so far?
Wonderful.
Yeah, it's been magical. It always is.
It always is. Every year, this is my 6th or 7th year coming here at this time and this week teaching this kind of workshop for 5 days. And at the outset, I've learned, there's that feeling sometimes in the room of trepidation or this, what's going to happen. I can sense some of the attendees are like, am I in the right place? Did I make the wrong decision by coming here? And always by the end of day one, people are coming up to me and saying, you're right, this is magical and it's wonderful. So it always is.
I mean, what is the goal? Is it that they're going to get in and generate a bunch of pages, or is they going to find inspiration?
Well, I wouldn't presume to have a goal for each person. I feel like people come here with their own intentions, right, and my job is to support them and to help them. So for some people, it is generating a lot of pages. For some people, it's writing for the first time, and it's catharsis and therapy and processing. And for other people, it's really developing their craft and learning from writers who, are further down the path. And that was one of the values when I founded this week. It was I wanted to welcome people from all sorts of experiences with writing, from the beginner to the advanced.
Right. One of the things that is not in the ecosystem is a lot of publishing anxiety, ego stuff, which is rare because most...
Michael, you out there?
Hello.
Sorry about that.
Take it from the top, Almond. Take it from the top.
No, I was just... Cheryl's not going to say it, but she's really created something that's pretty sui generis among writing conferences. It's not a writing conference, I guess, exactly, but there's serious discussion of craft, and people do have their own agenda. And we heard the first night, some people want to generate pages, other people really literally are writing for the first time. So there's a level of sophistication to the teaching, but a lot of it, most of it, is generative. So people are actually writing stuff. And I think people, when they're writing, they're going in search of themselves in some way or another. Sometimes it's in fictional disguise, and sometimes there's this sort of overlay of anxiety about will it get published and in what venue. And there's just almost no discussion of that here. We hear maybe a little bit at the end of the week amongst the more experienced campers, writers, whatever. But it's almost entirely absent during the week, which is just, you don't know how rare that is unless you're part of the writing community where there's this overlay of professional jealousy and anxiety and where am I in the big hierarchy. How to get in, and also how to get in, and also how to curry favor with the right people and network, and it's just not that vibe, which is it's primarily Cheryl and the week she's created, but Esalen in this space also enforces that idea.
Yeah. I mean, well, there's a reason that I decided to create this kind of workshop in this place.
Right.
And yeah, I think those workshops that really do emphasize how to get published and how to network in the literary orbit and all that. You know, I don't have a criticism of those kinds of workshops. I think that there were points in my own career that I needed the answer to those questions. I needed to learn how to work in that kind of, have that kind of knowledge.
Right.
But I think that it's just not important that it's here. This is about, I love the idea of creation, of making something that didn't exist before. And I love knowing that, the 140 some students that we've had in these 5 days are all leaving with something that didn't exist in the world before.
Yeah,
and so that to me is a beautiful thing. And, answering questions about how to get published, it doesn't feel like a beautiful thing to me. It feels like some, pretty important information at a certain point in one's career, but I don't want to do it here at Esalen. And that's not where I want to put my energies as a teacher.
Do you talk about process? I had questions for you guys have been doing this for a while and you've reached like a level of success and comfort with the art. Do you speak about your process with the writers here?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think this is what we do, essentially. This is how we were taught, is, writers who were a bit of, who had experience publishing before we were published. We asked them, how did you do this? Yeah. How did you learn how to write?
Yeah.
And they told us, and they told us their stories, and that's what we do as teachers too. We tell students our stories. How did Steve first figure out what it means to have empathy on the page, or how any number of things that all the teachers here share.
I mean, writing as an activity. I love when Hollywood tries to have the movie about the writer. It's like, oh, there he is, his typewriter, and another crumpled paper goes in the waste paper basket. It's like, it's boring. It's just what all the action is happening inside of somebody, and it's maybe transmitted into their keyboard, and there's a little clacking, but that's it. It's a person alone in the room and sort of in conversation with themselves and their memories and the world and their imagination, and it's thrilling on the page, but it's not dramatically satisfying to. That being said, so I get this question about process, Cheryl. I'm sure you get it even more than I do. And what I always say is figure out, which is something, frankly, that I stole from Amy Bender, and that's all we do, frankly, is just appropriate advice from other writers that's good advice and pass it along. She basically said, think about where you have created the best thing you've written, and think about the circumstances that obtained when you wrote that piece, and try to replicate those. Was it at night? Was it in the morning? Was it in a public place? Was it in a private place? Were you drinking coffee? Were you drinking booze? Was there music playing? Was it Coltrane or was it, Metallica? And that is, it sort of seems too simple, but people think that, and Cheryl, I know you deal with this all the time, they think that we have this sort of cache of secrets, or we have some fairy dust that we can maybe, if we're benevolent and they ask the right question the right way, we'll, sprinkle them with it. God, if I had that fairy dust, I'd be bathing in it, The point is for people to figure out what works for them and then how to create a space for that in their lives that's sustainable.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm always saying. Don't ask me whether you should do an MFA. Ask yourself, do a self-inventory and say, do I need that time, those 2 or 3 years to take it seriously, or can I create a practice without it, right? Yeah. And people hate it, but that's the real true answer, is you can't say, it's really up to you. You got to really do a self-inventory.
Yeah. And, and just the same when you even talk about how to write. So there's, the process, when do you write and under what conditions is good work made? And also, how do you make good work? Right. The answer is always, unfortunately, you just have to write a lot and you have to read a lot. I don't write every day. But I have eras in my life when I'm writing every day and writing a lot. And certainly when I was apprenticing myself to the craft and learning how to be a writer, the only way I found my way to any work that I might look at and say, okay, I finished that, or I feel a sense of accomplishment, is I wrote and I wrote and I wrote and I wrote. I didn't have any answers. There wasn't this idea that I knew how to write a novel or I knew how to write a memoir. I simply wrote a whole lot and thought very hard and revised and revised and revised. And that's how a book is made. And there's always this sort of, you talk about this in the classroom, and people look sort of sad because what you're telling them is you just have to work really hard, and nobody is going to give you the golden key that unlocks the golden door.
Right. What you can do, though, and I think what this week in particular tries to emphasize is, it's not about the noun of being a writer. In fact, the idea that you are a writer, capital W, is poison to somebody's artistic development. It's just it's essentially an anxiety about whether they're worthy or whether the story's interesting enough. It's a kind of ego drama that isn't about the story they're trying to tell. It's about them and their worth relative to some imagined set of readers or an audience. But the verb to write is much more important. And that's what I think is important about having generative workshops is everybody can see, oh, well, if I'm writing, then I guess I could think of myself as a writer, but what's more important is that at the moment I am writing. This person has induced a state in which I'm paying very careful attention to some set of memories or some imagined set of events, and that's what matters. I always say when we start these generative exercises, please don't try to be a writer. Please don't make pretty sentences. Please don't worry about, because that kind of self-consciousness just will completely destroy your spontaneous, intuitive, unconscious decisions. Yeah. And your artistic unconscious is like 20 times more powerful than your conscious intent to write a nice sentence.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
where's the learning curve now? What's difficult for you, and what's interesting in that way, challenging? Like after you've written a successful book, you've written 10 successful books.
Well, I'm going to speak for Cheryl because I know it's even truer for her than it is for me. I think the real difficulty, especially for Cheryl, but for me to a lesser degree, is how do I create space in my life to do the very solitary, lonely, doubt-choked work of writing when there are all these other exciting things that I could be doing that are meaningful and valuable. Cheryl spent a lot of time putting this week together, organizing it, being pleasantly in control of all the logistics and working things out with Esalen and all the students. It takes a lot of energy. Creates this beautiful week, but that is time that she doesn't have to devote to the next thing. We do this amazing podcast, which we love doing, but it kind of devours us for a week out of every 2 or 3 months. And then Cheryl has film stuff and a stage stuff, and lots of things that make it very difficult for a person who, like both of us are this way. We naturally want to really have an impact on the world, connect to people, sort of make an impact. It's hard, given all those very positive possibilities and opportunities, to say, all right, I need to step away from that and go back to my Warren and figure out what the next thing is, where you don't feel in control of it and you don't feel like you're making an impact. It's sort of, you have to just live in that doubt of, is this going to work? Is this thing worth it? And also for Cheryl especially, but for me too, there's pressure. People are watching now. Yeah. You have an audience that has expectations.
Right. Before, nobody cared. Right. I remember when I was sophomore in college at the University of Minnesota, there's this wonderful poet named Michael Dennis Brown. And I was in an introduction to creative writing class. And part of the class was that they would ask different writers to come into the classroom and tell us about their writing career. And he walked onto the stage and he had maybe 6 or 8 books all by him, poetry collections. And he set them on this table in the center of the stage. And he pointed to them and said, I've written all these books. And every time I begin a new one, it's like absolutely starting from scratch. It's like absolutely having never written a book before. And I didn't believe him because I was, 20 and, I was like, no, you've got it made. Right. But it's really true. And for me, the hardest part, it's everything Steve said. There are all these distractions and some of them are valid. One piece of being a writer, especially writers like the two of us, we're not introverts, really. Steve and I both really like teaching, and we like bringing our work into the world, and we like making connections. And, I feel like it's one of the greatest gifts of my life that I've had I've had the opportunity to talk to people all over the world about my work. And not because it's me talking about me, it's actually me hearing about what my work meant to them, how, hearing their stories. And so that's cool. But it does keep me from what I really want to do now is write that next book. And to write that next book, I have to overcome all of the same things that I had to overcome at the beginning of every book. And that is just to find my way to the intuitive place that Steve spoke about. I agree with him absolutely 100%, that's where the writing is done. And I'm always telling my students, trust your intuition. And of course, you begin with an idea, and it will lead to nothing if you don't trust that you have to let that idea fall away eventually. And that's a really scary thing to do. This is why most people don't ultimately, want to be artists, because that's what you have to trust. You have to trust the unknown, and you have to do it over and over again. And I will say that the one thing I think gets a little easier is the length of time, between sort of going from that place of beginning to that place of sinking into the work has shortened as I have become a more experienced writer. And it's maybe because I trust the process more. I know that it will come, and all I have to do is keep working, and it will come, and that kind of truth will reveal itself. But and maybe it doesn't take me as long to get there anymore.
Well, it's interesting what you're speaking about, in that success in a certain way can be a stumbling block. I want to steal a question from Tim Ferriss, who's another podcaster that I really enjoy, which is, can you think of any failures that set you up for future success?
Every damn thing. I mean, that's it. You don't know about our failures because we wrote and we wrote and we wrote and we wrote. Yeah. And there's a lot of stuff that never made it into the world.
Yeah. And also, just more broadly, most of what we write about are failures.
Yeah.
Cheryl's book opens with this moment of she loses her boot. She's completely ill-equipped. Or the scene that so many people connect to is Cheryl undertaking this, odyssey having completely.
I can't even lift my pack.
You can't even lift your pack. People live, actually, where they live is in doubt and uncertainty. And this kind of, any sort of moral assurance is it's demented. I mean, it's sort of the trademark of fascist thought. It's like being absolutely sure that you're right. Or it's a response to anxieties that lead to really bad political, social, and psychological circumstances. People are really in doubt all the time. So we find ourselves always, I always say to people, run towards the shame. That's where the truth is hiding, always in that area. And also in this state of, rather than writing, and Charles D'Ambrosio talks about this in these essays, Loitering, is every essay begins in doubt. And if it's any good, it sort of stays there in a certain way, because that's what readers can really connect to. So I don't look at failures. I mean, it's very painful to not succeed at something. And I get down on myself about it. I have a lot of failed projects that never take off, and I beat myself up about it. But I also have realized that doubt is kind of your engine.
Mm-hmm.
It's sort of the thing that keeps you going. And if you ever reach a point of self-satisfaction, I don't think it would be possible to do something as lonely and just sort of grueling in its isolation and concentration requirements as writing. There's a lot easier ways to get attention that aren't on layaway.
Yeah. Yes to everything Steve said. And one thing that I've had a very interesting past few years because of the success of Wild. I've been asked to give talks at a lot of places that are not in the literary world. So I'll be talking alongside somebody who is the CEO of a really high-end shoe company in Maine, or somebody, the guy who founded Blue Bottle Coffee in San Francisco, or any number of these.
Or introducing Hillary Clinton.
Or introducing, so these people who have been asked to tell their stories, and I'm like the artist who gets to tell her story, and then there's the corporate executive who tells his or her story, and on and on and on. And one thing that struck me about all of those stories that I had, really, honestly, all of those stories are a litany of the things that failed and mistakes that were made. And I think that success is so much about learning how to live in that doubt that Steve talks about, and how to actually see that kind of failure and mistake making as signs of growth and courage.
Right.
You know, I'm writing a TV show right now with my husband, adapting Tiny Beautiful Things for HBO, and I'm absolutely terrified because there's a very high chance that I will fail, and I'm not being falsely self-deprecating. I'm not just saying that. It's actually true. And I know that it's true. And part of me, you know, I'm thinking, why did I do this? Because I want to I want to do things that I succeed at. And yet the answer to that is I like to do things that are interesting and hard because they've always brought me good things in the end. I've always learned from those things.
Mm-hmm. It's this fascinating irony in any creative endeavor. As you get better, I think, or more experienced, you move through your apprenticeship, what's happening is you're developing a critical faculty, which is the capacity to judge your artistic decisions without judging yourself or your worth, right? But the irony of that is that as you become sort of stronger as a critic, assessing your own decisions, then you start to see that the work you did 6 months ago or a year ago or 2 years ago was crap. And so students are always, but it can block a lot of people because students feel like they start to develop a critical faculty and they realize that they've been writing stuff that's really partial and, you know, whatever, that it isn't like as brilliant as when they thought they created it. And I always have to remind them that's progress.
Yeah.
In artistic life and especially in writing, it's progress if your work seems crappy to you. The work that you were doing a year ago or, you know, 2 years ago should seem like there were certain category areas that you were making.
Well, and if not crappy, certainly, sort of holding things that making mistakes that you no longer make.
Right.
I had the really interesting experience of narrating the audiobook for my first book, Torch, which is a novel. And it was only after Wild was published that they asked me to do this audiobook. So the Torch came out in 2006, and so it wasn't until like 2012 or 13 that I was recording the audiobook of my first book. And I hadn't read it for years. And when you read an audiobook, you really have to read every word and sentence.
Yeah.
And what was so cool about it was, you know, on one hand, I felt like, okay, this is still okay. You know, I'm not ashamed of this book,
right.
but I could absolutely see my younger writer self.
Were you tempted to go in and be like,
absolutely, you know,
change a couple sentences?
I would, if I revised that book now, I would revise almost every page. And what it was is, it was so interesting. What I could see in Torch is I could see my influences. I could point to the page where I'd say, now here's where I was trying to be like Raymond Carver, and here's where I was trying to be like Alice Munro and Edna O'Brien, and on and on. Really, I could. And Wild, there isn't one page of Wild that I could point to that, even though all those people influenced me and led me to Wild. But by the time I was writing Wild, a few years later, I had actually done that thing that we talk about writers doing. I'd found my voice, which only means that I'd relaxed into the idea that I could only be who I was, and that my success wasn't going to be about, imitating these great writers. That's how we learn to write. Like, it's okay that I imitated those writers.
Right.
That's how you do it.
A drawer full of like crappy Dennis Johnson ripoffs.
That's right.
Like druggy, hazy stories and some crappy Laurie Moore ripoffs.
Yeah.
And, you know, you sort of go, okay, well, that's what I was up to.
And then you become Steve Almond. For better or worse.
Midlist pornographer, and then the rest is history, really.
Let's talk a little bit about the podcast. How did it come into being? And
it was Steve always has the idea. Steve has gotten me into a couple of bits of trouble with this sugar stuff. He started the Dear Sugar column on the Rumpus and then handed it off to me. And he also had the idea for the podcast. He just asked me one day to do it.
So my business model is that I sort of have a great idea, but I can't really execute it. So then I get Cheryl. She is the person who can actually execute it. But I do have the original idea.
That's right.
And it's true. I mean, I think one thing. So Lisa Tobin, we should also mention, who's our producer, and really kind of, it's really the three of us who do it. There's nobody else. There's no other staff. which doesn't sound exceptional, except, in the podcasting world, it's not like it's just one dude and a microphone. There's usually a kind of whole team of people and producers and so forth. But a lot of that work is really us and Lisa especially seeing the letters that are coming in, and we sort of want the audience to steer what we're talking about because they know what they're struggling with. But that I want to credit her as the person who said, well, do you think you think Cheryl would be interested in doing, revisiting sugar? And I said, well, it's not like I hadn't thought about it, but I said, well, you could ask her, but she's pretty busy. It was really when Wild was I think the film had just come out or was going to come out. And
a couple of years ago?
Yeah, a couple of years ago. So
like a year and a half ago.
Yeah, I mean, I basically I knew Cheryl's life from knowing her as a friend was insane and crazy. So I was like, I'm not going to ask her, but if you want to ask her, you can ask her, And it was to my great surprise and I was pleasantly shocked that you would entertain the possibility because I knew that we would enjoy it. But did you have time to do it?
No. It was a super bad idea, and
yes.
I
like everything I
like half the stuff I say yes to. I mean, honestly, like from any reasonable, rational perspective, I shouldn't have said yes.
Right.
I mean, actually, that's just true.
I know. That's why I didn't have Lisa. I mean, I was sort of like, you can ask her, but.
But I'm the sort of person who, I like to do things. I'm a doer and a joiner and a seeker. And I always find it interesting to try new things. And I like Steve. And so I was inclined to give it a whirl, and that's how I began writing the column too.
Right.
And, so that's sort of just the way I've lived my life, and it's led often to good things. It's been interesting because I've actually had to try to temper that because it's also led to things that, lately where it's just like, it's too much.
Yeah.
And how to, just how to balance my life has been a real question of this era. But what ended up happening too is, we also began the podcast just not really having many structured ideas. It was just, okay, let's answer people's questions. And we don't prepare in advance, like we don't discuss the letters in advance. We choose the letters and then we get in the studio like we are right now, sitting about this far away from each other.
Right.
And we read the letters out loud to each other and talk about them. So what you hear is a real conversation that we're having.
Right. And I think it was apparent, one of the things, because, we just tried it out. It was really apparent the first time we recorded in Portland. And it was like, oh, this is really an enjoyable thing to do, to be in conversation with this person, to be listening to what Cheryl has to say and her insights and sort of refining my thinking about certain things, sometimes, really shifting my thinking on certain things. And that if the conversation wasn't enjoyable, we just wouldn't do it.
Yeah.
And if it wasn't consistently enjoyable, because we enjoy, it's basically when we get to hang out.
Yeah, and we have
great. It's just so crazy. It's like I know I'm going to get to have like deep, heavy discussions with Cheryl and hang with her family, and I look forward to that. And if we didn't enjoy it, it would be very apparent. I mean,
we wouldn't do it.
Right, we wouldn't do it, and also it wouldn't have the same quality of collegiality is the wrong word, but of a kind of people thinking out loud in a very organic way.
Yeah.
Is it coincidence that you two are writers who are hosting the show, or is there something about the creation process which is akin to what happens when you put words down on a page?
Well, the central thing, which I think really Cheryl discovered in writing the Dear Sugar column was, the advice column model is pedantic and condescending and artificial, frankly. I'm struggling with us and such, and the authority will now hand down to me what the proper etiquette or answer is and so forth. And that's not what people want. People want to be heard. They want whatever they're struggling with to be received by people who feel it and understand it, in some ways can speak back to them and say, yeah, that's what you're feeling. And that's perfectly reasonable to feel that way, but it might block you from moving forward unless you think about these other things that you should do to get yourself unstuck. Cheryl was doing that primarily in the column almost entirely by telling her own stories, places where she had failed, places where she was stuck, places where she really struggled and felt lost and bereft. And people are so reassured by that. And so that was really the innovation. So we knew by the time we're at the podcast, because of the work Cheryl had done, frankly, that was what people were looking for. They weren't looking for answers. They were looking to be heard with whatever they're struggling with, and maybe some thoughtful ideas and insights. But that's not the central thing.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the things that I discovered right away when I said yes to writing the Dear Sugar column was that, literature is my self-help. I don't read self-help books.
Right.
I shockingly wrote one. When I see Tiny Beautiful Things in that self-help category, I always think, I think of myself as the accidental self-help author. And I don't mean to say that there aren't valuable books in that genre. I'm not discounting that as a genre, but I think really as a culture, we've misunderstood what self-help means. The power of story, the power of,
right.
One person telling the story of their life or their struggle or their suffering, whether that person be a real person or a fictional person who's been created for us by a writer. Those are the things that have been my consolation, my enlightenment, the ways that I've sort of understood myself and the world and others. And I wanted to give the world that through my own writing. Like, that was always my mission. I always had a sense of mission as a writer, that I wanted to help people. And, I think I did that. I've done that in all of my books. The thing that people said to me about Torch when Torch first came out is thank you. Because that, I understand what it means to grieve too, and you wrote about that in a way that felt true to me. And so it was interesting when I was handed this opportunity to actually directly help people,
right.
to say the whole purpose of this, the stated purpose of an advice column is to help people. And I realized pretty quickly that I wasn't doing anything different in this Dear Sugar column as I'd been doing as a novelist or an essayist or a memoirist. Right. And so I just decided to throw away the idea that I was going to be this authority who was going to tell people what to do. Right. And instead I was going to write literary essays about what it means to be human, about what it means to love and lose and struggle and triumph. And I put it all into those columns.
Right. In a sense, the letters were a kind of prompt for Cheryl.
Yeah.
She said, here's this person, this fellow traveler who's struggling with this. And what's the story that I can tell them that will make them feel less alone with it, and to sort of ultimately realize, people go through this and it's very difficult, but they do get through. Mm-hmm. And, so that's really turning that model of the advice column on its head, where you don't say, I have the answer. You say, I too have felt that doubt and that uncertainty, and that's tough. And here's my story. And then people go, oh, and
then we're saying we will grapple with you.
Right.
I mean, this is what we do on the show is we'll tell stories about ourselves if we have some connection to the topic. We'll call off more often than not. Our guests who we call are also writers. Sometimes they're experts on an issue, but we're far more likely to call a novelist or an essayist who's written in some ways on that subject. Yeah. And I think it's because we believe in the power of story as much as we believe in the power of science or any of these other ways that we can know something or come at an issue. And it's amazing how much people really respond. They love when we tell stories about ourselves on the show. They somehow I think a letter, and I hear this over and over again, especially in the letters in Tiny Beautiful Things. People will say, well, I read the letter and I thought, that's a problem that I don't have. It's not about me. Right. And then the answer was about them. Yeah. And I think that's what we try to do on the podcast too. Yeah. That we might be talking, the theme might be, fertility or infidelity or whatever it is, but we always try to widen the conversation so that it actually spills over into, it's not just an issue-oriented episode. I mean, I'm not interested in that.
Yeah. Is it good for your writing to have a break from the writing in a certain way? I think that something that some writers will grapple with is the isolationist lifestyle of writing. Is it helpful for you to remain connected in this way to other people's issues?
Well, I think what I'd say is it's deeply meaningful, rewarding work. I haven't thought about the extent to which I put it in a different category in a way. But I think one thing it does reflect is, this is what you want when you go to a piece of literature, nonfiction, fiction, whatever it is, poetry, is you want that feeling of being in the room with a wise, dangerous mind, that you're in conversation. And, that's more or less what we try to do I think it's very different from things that are written down. You can't craft it as well. You can't edit yourself into eloquence. But it is the same basic the thing that people come to the podcast for is, I think, what they also come to good writing for. They want to be in the presence of and hear a kind of, or take part in a conversation that somehow implicates them. Even if it's not directly, they're not struggling with infidelity. They're certainly struggling with whatever leads us to infidelity. And I'm not sure that it's had an impact on my writing, but it does keep alive this idea that more or less your job as a writer is to kind of talk onto the page, to get as much of your personality, your insights in as organic a way as you can onto the page. And I found that kind of writing, nonfiction writing, to be probably a little bit easier, because you realize it really does come across. People don't want your artistry. They don't want your craft. They want your, the truthful things that you have to say about whatever you're struggling with. Cheryl read this piece last night about, which I've heard you talk about, that first, about the birth of her oldest child, Carver, but always in kind of, not cocktail chatter, but like, the labor war story. Mm-hmm. But this was this much more complicated, but it was exactly the kind of story. It's funny, profane, strange, and eccentric. Cheryl's always getting herself into some kind of mischief, usually on some other continent. There's always some like weird stranger with one eye and a limp and a parrot on his lip. You're like a nut magnet. But it also has Cheryl's deep wisdom, her self-reflection, her thoughts about motherhood, her doubt about it, her deep well of love, her, all that stuff somehow, sort of came out in that piece. And I think it was more, it was brilliantly crafted, but I can imagine you're telling that story to somebody on the podcast. It just wouldn't be so brilliantly crafted.
Yeah, no, I think the podcast is really different from writing, obviously. And especially, if you think of the podcast as an extension of that work that I did as Dear Sugar, I really think of it not quite in that way. I mean, I'm still giving advice, but in such a different form that it's, it's not the same. It's conversation rather than writing, but it is digging beneath, which is what's always been interesting to me. That's my thing. Like, I always wanted to know the secret story of us. And we get to receive all those letters. Yeah. And so I would say that being on the other end of those letters, the letters that you never hear on the air, the letters you never read in the column, it confirms everything I've come to believe about what it means to be human. And so it expands my view, and in some ways, I can see that feeding my work in ways that are discreet and not at all direct, but present.
And I would say, actually, what it reminds you of when we go through our inbox, it's hard to be human. People are carrying around a lot of struggle and you don't see it in your most, you might see it with that group that's just right around you, but even relatives and close friends, you don't know everything they're struggling with, because the really deepest, darkest, most painful stuff they hold back. And it's this kind of revelation reading these letters, which are, by the way, brilliantly written. Everybody says, oh, you must really have to edit those letters. You must have to. It's not. It's partly what the writers' camp is getting at, is everybody naturally, if they will get out of their own way, is quite a remarkable storyteller. And they have this amazing, difficult story to tell, which is what it's like for them to move through life and be a human and live with doubt and loss and all these bewilderments that are common to all of us. And that's what you see in these letters that's so astonishing. And it kind of reifies that idea of, like, there's nobody who doesn't have a really tortured, complex internal life and a set of issues that they're struggling with. It's just part of the human arrangement. You sort of go, okay, good, we're in the right line of business.
Yeah, we are. Well, and that's one of the first questions I asked myself when Steve asked me to to take over the Dear Sugar column all those years ago was, who am I to give anyone advice? And it demanded that I really rethink what advice is, or what it means, how I've received advice, and it led me back to literature again, literature being my self-help. And I do think that we are actually really well trained for this job, because the job of the writer is to wonder about what it means to be human. In order to create a character who wants to leave her marriage because she's realized she's a lesbian, we need to be able to imagine all of the things that might go into that moment. And, we spent our 20s and 30s and maybe even before that, imagining those sorts of things, putting people in conflict with themselves and others on the page, and trying to make them credible. And so when people then come and ask us for this advice, it's almost like we're using those kind of skills as writers that we have to use every day. What would it be like to be you? Not everyone has that as part of their job description, having to wonder that for hours and years on end, right?
That's right, yeah.
And so I really do think that writers are very well prepared. And also, though, our podcast listeners will note, Steve is brilliant. He's smarter than me. And he was raised by two I always want to call them psychotherapists, but they're actually psychoanalysts. Yeah. And he comes from this tradition of really, it's in his bones, that kind of, being able to make those kinds of inquiries and have those conversations. I think it's part of, really it's part of where you come from.
Yeah, it's true. I think of it as like also part of the rabbinical tradition. That part of what we're doing is, people come to, they lose their way, they're struggling, and they want somebody. But I asked Cheryl to take over the column, and then asked her to do the podcast, or sort of got Lisa to ask her, because, I'd seen her in action. I understood that both from her work, but also just how she moves through the world, she's an advice giver. She's a caretaker. She wants to make sure everybody's doing okay. And she's also really sharp and, intuitively has a lot of that. It doesn't have to be in the groundwater. You just are a certain sort of person who is always wondering if everybody else is in the same turmoil that you are, or what their sort of turmoil is. Who's genuinely curious about what people are struggling with and how they might be able to help, or sort of lend some insight to them. So that's a certain personality type, and I have maybe some of that. Certainly it comes through with my parents' profession, but there's also, I think, a kind of tribe of people who are deeply interested in that kind of intense engagement in people's internal lives. And those people do wind up being artists and in particular writers. Yeah. They're drawn to that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that the two of us have that kind of chemistry where we come from very different places in terms of the cultures where we grew up, how we grew up, our family systems and so forth. But we ended up in the same place, as writers, and we recognized each other.
Yeah, and that's nice.
Very well
nice.
Through our work too. that's how I first came to know Steve. I was a fan of his work, and really deeply admired his intelligence and his heart, and so that's how I came to know Steve, and then I came to know him as a person too.
And that's true of me as well. We met Cheryl on the way. Well, we met in Portland. I think maybe she had a big. You were starting family.
Yeah.
And we were just starting family or discussions around, and then very quickly, my wife was pregnant, and we met Cheryl on the way in Utah, I guess, on the way across the country, and my wife was pregnant. She told my wife very charmingly this amazing story of the birth of her first son.
Who was 11 pounds.
Who was 11 pounds and was had at home after many, many hours, more than one day.
No, not hours, days.
I know, days. It's almost at a week. But at any rate, she was in the way that she told it to Aaron was not, the war story to terrorize you, but, you get through it and it's beautiful. But
I was saying, you can do this.
You can do this, right. And she was very moved by that. We got Torch and both read it. And, we became fans and admirers and knew, the irony is that we thought of Cheryl as the author of Torch, and then finally the world said, no, she's the author of Wild. And we're like, no, she's the author of Torch. The world wins.
The world wins.
Great. Well, I know you got to get out of here.
Yeah.
Well, awesome. Thank you so much for speaking with me
Yeah,
today.
it was our
And
pleasure.
It was
thank
great
you for
talking to you.
teaching at Esalen.
Yeah, we love it.
We love Esalen. We'll be back next year. Thanks.
All right. Oh, now we
Okay.
have to get up.
My
Watch this.
my leg's asleep. Like, I really don't think I can get up. All I can say, Steve, is I'm so glad that you are also having this trouble. Because
Middle-aged. Okay, hold on. We're gonna do.
if it was just gonna be me, I was gonna have to cover my. Okay, not like this leg is.
That looks.
Thanks so much for listening to Voices of Esalen. Today's show was produced in conjunction with Cheryl Franzel, Geraldine Hess, Lori Putnam, Shannon Hudson, and Ian Golden. Our music today is performed by Wineland. It's a song called Hardly Worth Saving. If you want to hear more episodes of Voices of Esalen, and I'm sure you do, please subscribe to us on iTunes. You can also find us on the web at esalen.org. That's ESALEN. Until next time, thanks very much and be well.